The bet 83:00 a.m. Las Vegas, June 1963. The Sands Hotel pulsed like a living heart in the middle of the desert night, its golden lights burning against the black sky, its casino floor still humming even though most of the shows had ended hours earlier. Down below, tourists staggered between neon signs and ringing slot machines, chasing luck, chasing dreams, chasing the feeling that something extraordinary might happen before sunrise. But the real magic of Vegas wasn't happening on the casino floor. It was happening high above it, in a private suite on the top floor, where the noise faded into a distant murmur and only laughter, clinking glasses, and old friendships filled the air. Frank Sinatra's suite had become a kind of unofficial headquarters for the Rat Pack. After every show, after every standing ovation, after every encore, the same ritual unfolded. The doors closed, the jackets came off, the bottles came out, and the public personas were slowly set aside. No stage lights, no microphones, no photographers, just men who had conquered the world and were still at heart, a group of boys who never quite got over the thrill of making each other laugh. Sammy Davis Jr. lounged across one of the sofas, jacket tossed over the armrest, tapping a slow rhythm on his knee, his eyes half closed as if he were still listening to the echo of the orchestra from downstairs. Peter Lawford stood near the bar, carefully mixing another round, insisting on doing it himself even though a staff bartender waited discreetly in the background. Joey Bishop occupied the corner near the window, firing off quiet one-liners that kept earning groans and bursts of laughter in equal measure. And near that same window, slightly apart from the rest, sat Dean Martin. Dean wasn't slouched the way people expected him to be. He wasn't playing the part of the drunk crooner or the careless joker. He sat back in a leather chair, one ankle resting on his knee, a real scotch in his hand, not a prop, not watered down, just enough to warm him. He watched the strip through the glass, the endless river of headlights, the blinking signs, the tiny figures drifting between entrances, and for a moment he looked less like a superstar and more like a man alone with his thoughts. Sammy noticed it. Sammy always noticed it. They'd known each other too long for masks to work. Sammy leaned forward slightly on the couch. "You ever think about how strange this all is?" he said casually, as if he weren't cutting straight through the noise. "All of it, Vegas, the crowds, the noise, us." Dean smiled faintly without turning. "Every night," he said, "and every morning when I wake up and can't remember which city I'm in." Sammy chuckled, but his eyes stayed on Dean. "I mean it, man. We walk out there and people scream like we're not real, like we're some kind of idea instead of people." Dean took a slow sip. "That's because the idea is easier to love." Frank Sinatra stood near the center of the room, jacket draped over a chair, sleeves rolled up, drink in hand, energized in that way he only got after a great show. He had been talking, holding court, really, about music, about the business, about how songs were changing, about what separated records that disappeared from records that lived forever. He was in one of those moods where his voice carried weight, where everyone listened even when he wasn't trying to be profound. "You know what the problem is with most songwriters today?" Frank said, gesturing with his glass. "They try too hard, they stack words on top of words, they polish the soul right out of it. The songs that last, they're simple, they're honest. They come from somewhere real." Sammy nodded. "Like my way. That ain't poetry, that's confession." "Exactly," Frank snapped his fingers. "Truth, that's the currency, not cleverness, truth." Dean finally turned his head toward him. "Not everyone can do that, Frank, that's a skill." Frank scoffed lightly. "It's not a skill, it's a decision. You decide to stop hiding." Dean raised an eyebrow. "You make it sound easy." "It is easy," Frank said, pacing now, warming to his own argument. "Verse, chorus, bridge, one emotion, that's it. Anybody in this room could write a song if they stopped thinking and started feeling." Dean set his glass down slowly on the side table. "Anybody?" he asked. Frank turned toward him. "Anybody." Dean held his gaze. "Even me." Frank didn't hesitate. "Especially you." A small silence fell over the room. Not heavy, not tense, just attentive. "I've never written a song in my life," Dean said evenly. "So," Frank replied. "So maybe you're underestimating how hard it is." Frank smiled, but there was challenge in it. "I'll tell you what, I'll bet you $1,000 you could write a real song, right now, tonight, in 10 minutes. The room froze. Joey's joke died on his lips. Peter slowly stopped stirring his drink. Sammy sat upright. 1,000, Sammy repeated. Dean studied Frank's face. And if I can't, then I keep my money and you admit I was right. And if I can, Frank took a step closer, then I pay you and I record your song. That changed everything. Sammy let out a low whistle. Oh, this just got serious. You'd really put your name on something I wrote? Dean asked. If it's real, Frank said. If it's honest, if it holds. Dean stood. He wasn't smiling now. Where's the piano? Frank pointed toward the corner of the suite, where a polished black Steinway waited, rarely used but always tuned. Dean walked to it slowly. Sammy followed him with his eyes, his expression unreadable. Money began to appear on the table, small side bets, laughing wagers. But underneath the jokes was something sharper, the knowledge that songwriting wasn't a trick, it was exposure. Frank checked his watch. 10 minutes, he said, starting now. Dean sat. The bench felt colder than he expected. The room, which had always been loud, suddenly seemed enormous in its quiet. He placed his hands on the keys. And nothing happened. No melody. No words. Just noise in his head. He could feel their eyes on his back, not cruel, not mocking, just waiting. He closed his eyes. Frank's words echoed, simple, honest, real. What was real? The strip outside the window. The applause. The money. The laughter. The women. The flights. The hotels. The persona. And underneath it, the tiredness. The quiet. The loneliness. The feeling of being surrounded and still somehow separate. He pressed one key. Then another. A basic progression. Nothing impressive. Just something steady. His fingers moved again. And then, without deciding to, he sang. Softly, almost to himself. The words weren't clever, they weren't polished, they didn't try to impress. They confessed. He sang about wearing a smile that wasn't always his. About rooms full of people where he still felt invisible. About missing the man he used to be before the name, Dean Martin, swallowed Dino Crosty. About wanting to go back to a time when he could walk down a street without being seen. The melody formed around the feeling. Not sad. Wistful. Like a man talking to his own reflection at 3 in the morning. A verse. A chorus. Another verse. The room was so quiet he could hear the soft click of the watch on Frank's wrist. A bridge rose out of nowhere, lifting the song before gently laying it back down. He finished. The last note hung in the air. 8 minutes had passed. No one spoke. Sammy was the first to move. He stood slowly. Dean, he said under his breath. Frank walked to the piano. Play it again, he said. Dean did. And when he finished the second time, Frank placed a hand on his shoulder. That, he said quietly, isn't a bet, that's a truth. Dean turned. So I win. Frank pulled out his wallet and handed him 10 crisp bills. You won before the money ever came out. But Dean barely noticed. Because something inside him had just shifted. And Sammy knew it. Sammy looked at him with a mixture of pride and awe. Man, he said softly, you just showed us a part of you we never see. Dean looked back at the keys. And for the first time that night, he didn't feel like Dean Martin. He felt like himself. When the song left the room did not immediately return to laughter after Dean finished playing. That was the first sign something rare had happened. In Frank Sinatra's suite, silence usually meant boredom or fatigue. But this silence was different. It was alert. It was listening even after the sound was gone. It was the kind of quiet that follows a confession rather than a performance. Dean still sat at the piano, his hands resting lightly on the keys, feeling the faint vibration fade beneath his fingertips. He had expected applause or teasing or at least a joke from Joey to break the tension. Instead, he felt as though the room itself were holding its breath. When he finally turned, he saw expressions he had almost never seen on these men's faces at the same time. Seriousness, reflection, and something dangerously close to reverence. Sammy was standing now, no longer lounging, his body unconsciously angled toward Dean as if pulled by the gravity of what he had just heard. He wasn't smiling. His eyes shone in that particular way they did when something went past entertainment and touched something personal. Frank remained beside the piano, one hand still on Dean's shoulder, his gaze lowered, not at Dean but at the keys, as though the song were still there, hovering, invisible, daring to be dismissed. Peter Lawford quietly set his drink down on the bar, forgotten. Joey Bishop did not speak at all, which, in that room, was almost shocking. Dean broke the silence himself, trying to lighten something he didn't yet understand. He turned on the bench slightly, attempting the crooked half-smile people expected from him, and said, "So, I guess I don't owe anyone money." A few chuckles surfaced, polite but thin, like someone laughing in a church. Sammy crossed the room and leaned against the piano, close enough that Dean could feel his presence without looking. "That wasn't just a song," Sammy said quietly. "That was you." Dean shrugged, unsure why his throat suddenly felt tight. "It was just what came out." "That's the part that scares people," Sammy replied, "when something real comes out." Frank finally straightened and exhaled as if he'd been underwater. "We need to write this down," he said. "Right now, before it changes, before it gets explained away." He reached for a notepad from the side table, shoved it toward Dean, and slid a pen across the polished wood. "Play it again, slowly." Dean turned back to the piano. This time, the notes came more easily, as if the song had decided to cooperate now that it knew it was being taken seriously. He played and sang, not performing, not projecting, just tracing what had already been born, while Frank scribbled lines, stopping him occasionally to clarify a word, a phrasing, a turn of melody. Sammy watched over Frank's shoulder, occasionally interrupting, suggesting a small change in a chord, a shift in rhythm, not to polish but to protect what was fragile in it. The energy in the room had changed. This was no longer a party. It was a studio without microphones, a birthplace. Time slipped in a way it rarely did in Vegas. The neon outside the window faded from blinding to gentle. Somewhere far below, the casino crowd thinned. The sun began its slow attempt at the desert horizon, painting the edge of the sky with a color that felt strangely appropriate. By the time anyone thought to look at a clock again, it was after 5. The song now existed on paper. It had a shape, a name, a fragile permanence. Dean looked at the title he had written almost without thinking, before the spotlight. He didn't know where the words had come from, but now that they were there, they seemed inevitable. "That's exactly what it is," Sammy said when he read it. "The moment before the world sees you, before you have to become something." Dean nodded slowly. He had never put that thought into words before, but it was true. Everything he had sung had lived in that space. As the suite finally began to empty, the staff quietly clearing glasses, the city outside fully surrendering to mourning, Frank walked Dean toward the door. The others lingered behind them, still discussing the song, replaying pieces of it, already treating it as something real rather than a stunt. At the threshold, Frank stopped him. "You know what you did tonight?" Frank said, his voice lower, stripped of showmanship. "You scared the hell out of me," Dean laughed. "That bad?" Frank shook his head. "That honest." "I've known you a long time, pal. You hide better than almost anyone I've ever met, and in 8 minutes you dropped the whole disguise. You didn't write a song, you let one happen." Dean looked down the empty hallway, the patterned carpet stretching toward the elevators like a quiet runway. "I didn't plan any of it." "Exactly," Frank replied. "That's why it worked." He hesitated, then added, "I meant what I said, I'm recording it, but more than that. Don't you dare walk away from this like it was a trick. You've got more in you than you've ever let yourself touch." Dean didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure what the right answer was. Finally, he said, "I don't even know what I'm supposed to do with it." Frank smiled slightly. "We'll figure that out, that's the easy part." 2 weeks later, Dean found himself standing in a recording studio he had visited countless times, yet somehow it felt unfamiliar. Capitol Records had cleared an afternoon, not a rush job, not a novelty session. Frank had personally arranged it, pulling favors, insisting on musicians who understood restraint as much as they understood skill. The room was warm with the smell of polished wood and cables. Sheet music lay on stands. A small string section murmured to itself in one corner. A pianist ran quiet scales, almost reverently, as though he sensed the nature of what he was about to touch. Sammy stood near the glass of the control room, not performing, not joking, simply present, as if his being there was part of the song's structure. Dean adjusted the headphones on his ears and stepped up to the microphone. He had sung into hundreds of them. He had leaned into them with swagger, with charm, with practiced ease. This time he didn't lean. He stood straight, hands loose at his sides, feeling strangely exposed without realizing why. Through the glass, the producer asked if he wanted a test run. Dean shook his head. "Let's just do it." The pianist's opening chords filled the room, familiar yet transformed. The strings slipped in gently like a memory rising. Dean closed his eyes, and when he sang, something in his voice was different. The smoothness was still there, the control, the phrasing people loved. But beneath it was a crack he usually smoothed over, a vulnerability he usually kept buried. He wasn't acting, he wasn't selling, he was revisiting. The song unfolded the way it had in Frank's suite, but deeper now, as if the studio itself were giving it permission to breathe. Dean sang about the noise and the mask and the longing for a quieter self, and he heard it echo back to him through the headphones, not as a performer's sound but as a person's confession. He finished the final line and held still, afraid that moving might break something. In the control room, no one spoke. The tape continued to spin, capturing even the soft sound of his breathing. Finally, the producer's voice came through the speaker. "Dean, that was complete." Dean swallowed. "You want another?" There was a pause, then a soft laugh. "No, we don't touch that." Sammy stepped out of the control room and into the studio, crossing the floor with a quiet urgency. He didn't joke, he didn't exaggerate. He simply said, "That's the truest thing I've ever heard you sing." Word traveled through the building before the tape had even cooled. Engineers from other rooms wandered by under the excuse of errands. Assistants lingered too long. Musicians asked to hear the playback again. There was no shouting, no celebration, just the subtle gravity that forms around something people sense they should not interrupt. Dean listened to the playback once, standing behind the producer, hearing his own voice without the armor he usually wore. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply nodded once. "That's it," he said quietly, and for the rest of the day he felt unsettled in a way success had never unsettled him before. When Capitol discussed the release weeks later, the room was not unified. Executives leaned back in their chairs, arms folded, listening politely but cautiously. Dean Martin was known. He sold records, he filled rooms, but this song was not what people expected from him. It wasn't swinging, it wasn't flirtatious, it didn't sparkle, it lingered. Some suggested placing it quietly on an album rather than risking it as a single. Others argued radio wouldn't know what to do with it. One man finally asked the question hovering over the table. "Who is this for?" Frank, who had joined the meeting without invitation, answered before anyone else could. "For anyone who's ever smiled in public and felt alone in private." The room went still. Decisions were delayed, charts were examined, risks were weighed, but something about the tape refused to be reduced to numbers. Eventually, almost reluctantly, they agreed to test it. The first station to play it was in Los Angeles. A late-night DJ slipped it into his rotation without fanfare, introducing it simply as a new Dean Martin recording. Within an hour, the phones lit. Not with excitement, with recognition. Listeners didn't shout. They talked. They spoke about night shifts, about long drives, about marriages that looked good from the outside, about success that didn't quiet certain feelings. The station played it again the next night, and the next. In New York, a producer initially resisted it, calling it too inward. A young assistant convinced him to try it once late, near midnight. The next morning, the request logs were full. Not of teenagers, of adults, of people who didn't usually call radio stations, people who had heard something they didn't know they were waiting for. Sammy called Dean one evening from his hotel room, voice low, almost disbelieving. "They're playing it everywhere," he said, "not as a Dean Martin song, as a people's song." Dean sat on the edge of his bed, phone pressed to his ear, staring at the carpet. "That doesn't make sense." Sammy smiled on the other end. "Neither did you writing it, didn't stop it from being real." By the time Dean returned to Vegas that fall, before the spotlight had become something he could not outrun, it was on the charts. It was in the newspapers. Critics wrote about a new side of Dean Martin. Some praised it, some were unsettled by it. None ignored it, and for the first time in his career, Dean felt a strange nervousness before going on stage that had nothing to do with forgetting lyrics or missing cues. He was afraid of standing in front of people and offering them something that did not protect him. On the night Frank announced it from the Sands stage, the applause was thunderous before Dean even appeared. When he finally walked out and sat at the piano, the room did something he had almost never seen it do. It quieted itself. He played the opening chords, and as he began to sing, he could feel the audience leaning toward him, not physically but emotionally, the way people do when they are being told something they recognize but have never heard said out loud. From the wings, Sammy watched, arms crossed, jaw tight, not with worry but with pride. He could see it in Dean's shoulders, in the way his voice did not lean into charm, in the way he let the words land without cushioning them. This was not the Dean Martin the world thought it knew. This was the man who had sat at a piano at 3 in the morning and told the truth when he hadn't known he was allowed to. And as the final note faded, and the silence broke into an ovation that did not feel like noise but gratitude, Sammy understood something clearly for the first time. The bet had never been about a song. It had been about whether Dean Martin would ever step out from behind the version of himself everyone loved and allow the world to meet the man who had created him. When the world heard Him. By winter, before the spotlight no longer belonged to Dean Martin. It belonged to late-night radio, to long drives across empty highways, to quiet apartments where the television stayed off, to men sitting alone in kitchens after their families had gone to bed, to women staring out windows with coats still on, keys in their hands, not yet ready to go inside. It slipped into the background of people's lives the way memory does, not demanding attention, simply appearing when it was needed. The record climbed the charts steadily, without the sudden spike of a novelty hit, without the artificial push of a manufactured anthem. It rose the way something real rises, carried by recognition rather than hype. And everywhere it went, it left the same strange aftermath behind it. Silence first, then conversation. Dean felt that change long before the numbers confirmed it. He felt it in the way audiences listened now. His shows were still sold out, the laughter still came, the applause still crashed. But underneath the familiar rhythm of entertainment, something new pulsed. When he sang the song, rooms that had once buzzed with cocktail chatter grew attentive. Glasses stopped clinking, waiters paused, couples leaned closer not to each other but to the sound. He had spent his career mastering how to hold a crowd. This was different. This was the first time he had felt a crowd hold him. Backstage after one of those shows, Dean sat in his dressing room longer than usual, costume half removed, tie loosened, staring at his reflection as if it belonged to someone else. The applause from the showroom still throbbed faintly through the walls, but it sounded distant now, like surf heard from inside a cave. He was used to that echo feeling like fuel. Tonight it felt like a question. There was a knock. Sammy came in without waiting, carrying 2 glasses of water instead of drinks. He handed one to Dean and took the chair opposite him, studying him carefully. "You all right?" he asked. Dean nodded, then shook his head. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've been doing this my whole life, making rooms happy, making it easy, and now it doesn't feel easy anymore." Sammy took a slow sip of water. "Because you stopped hiding." Dean looked at him. Sammy met his eyes. "When you sing that song, you're not entertaining them, you're letting them see you. That costs more." Dean leaned back, exhaling. "Feels like I cracked something open and I don't know how to close it." Sammy smiled faintly. "Maybe you're not supposed to." The industry responded in its own complicated way. Magazine profiles shifted tone. Interviews grew quieter, more personal. Writers who once focused on Dean's charm and ease now asked about his childhood, his divorces, his silences. They wanted to know where the song came from, what had been happening in his life, what he had been thinking. At first he deflected, habit pulling him back toward jokes and half-answers. But the questions kept returning, patient and persistent, like the song itself. Eventually he began to answer differently. Not fully, but more than before. He spoke about exhaustion, about the distance fame creates, about missing parts of himself he hadn't known how to name. Each time he did, he felt exposed, and each time letters arrived afterward thanking him for saying what others could not. Sammy saw the cost before anyone else. He saw it in the way Dean withdrew after shows instead of going out, in the way he sometimes sat alone at pianos in empty ballrooms long after crews had packed up, in the way laughter now seemed to require more effort, as if some part of Dean had stepped away from the surface and gone somewhere deeper, where jokes didn't travel as easily. One night after a charity event in Chicago, Sammy found him alone in the hotel lounge, lights dimmed, the city spread out beyond the windows. Dean was not drinking. He was listening to a recording of the song through headphones, eyes closed. "You're going to wear a groove in that tape," Sammy said lightly. Dean didn't open his eyes. "I'm trying to remember what it felt like before it existed." Sammy sat beside him. "Why?" "Because now," Dean said, finally looking at him, "everything's measured against it. Every note, every crowd, every night. I didn't know you could change your own standard." Sammy considered him. "That's what happens when you tell the truth. You don't get to pretend you don't know it anymore." The song crossed boundaries Dean had never aimed at. Jazz singers recorded it with stripped-down arrangements that felt like late-night confessions. Country artists turned it into stories of small towns and lost selves. A young folk singer performed it on a television show with nothing but an acoustic guitar, her voice trembling in a way that made the audience lean forward. Each version bent it, but none broke it. Everywhere it went, it carried the same quiet ache, the same recognition. Dean listened to some of them alone, not as a celebrity monitoring his influence, but as a man hearing pieces of himself refracted through strangers. He began to understand that the song had not simply come from him. It had passed through him. Frank watched this transformation with a mix of pride and unease. He had wanted Dean to discover something. He had not anticipated how deeply it would reach. One evening in New York, after they shared a stage at a benefit, Frank invited Dean up to his hotel room. It felt in an echoing way like that first night in Vegas, but the energy was different. No crowd of friends, no bets, just two men with long histories and longer silences. Frank poured coffee instead of whiskey. "You opened a door," Frank said, handing Dean a cup. "I'm not sure you realized how heavy it was." Dean gave a tired smile. "I'm starting to." Frank studied him. "You don't have to live in that space all the time." "I know," Dean replied, "but I can't pretend it isn't there." Frank nodded slowly. "That's the price. Once you find a deeper note, the shallow ones don't satisfy you the same way." Dean looked out the window. "I built a whole career on shallow ones." "No," Frank corrected gently. "You built a career on connection. This is just a different kind." It was Frank who suggested Dean start writing more, not as a stunt, not as a response to success, but as a practice. A place to put what had been stirred. At first, Dean resisted. "I got lucky once," he said. "That's not the same thing." Frank shook his head. "Luck doesn't write that kind of honesty. Work does, or at least willingness." Sammy supported it immediately. He began showing up with notebooks, leaving them in Dean's dressing rooms, in his hotel rooms, on pianos without comment. "In case something wants out," he'd say casually. And sometimes something did. Not always a song, sometimes just lines, images, half-memories, thoughts about his children, about his father, about the strange feeling of being loved by people who did not know him. Slowly, unevenly, Dean began to collect them. The first time he played one of these new pieces for Sammy, it was late, in an empty rehearsal space in Lowe's Angels. The song was unfinished, wandering, unsure of itself. Dean stopped halfway through and shook his head. "It's not good." Sammy leaned back in his chair. "It's honest." "That doesn't mean it works," Sammy smiled. "No, but it means it's worth finding out." Dean stared at the keys. "I don't know if I want another before the spotlight," Sammy softened. "You don't get to choose that. You only get to choose whether you keep telling the truth." Publicly, Dean's image was shifting in ways publicists couldn't fully control. Audiences still adored him, but there was a new respect layered into the applause. People wrote about him differently, not just as a star, but as an artist. That word, which had once felt ornamental, now felt heavy. Interviews asked about process instead of persona. Reviewers spoke about vulnerability. Even those who didn't particularly like the song acknowledged its seriousness. Dean read some of these articles in private, folding the magazines away afterward as if they were personal letters rather than publications. He did not frame them. He did not quote them. He did not fully believe them, but he felt them. The real shift revealed itself not in headlines, but in moments. In a man approaching him quietly in a hotel corridor and saying the song had helped him admit something to his wife. In a young performer waiting by a stage door and thanking him for proving that charm and honesty could exist in the same body. In a woman sending a note explaining she played the record every night after putting her children to bed because it reminded her she still existed outside of responsibility. Dean kept these letters, not neatly, not organized, folded into pockets, tucked into drawers, left between pages of books. He didn't reread them often, but he needed to know they were there. Sammy remained his anchor through it all. He deflected the industry noise when it grew too loud. He brought laughter back into rooms when seriousness threatened to harden. He reminded Dean when necessary that he was still allowed to enjoy himself, still allowed to be light, still allowed to entertain. "Truth doesn't cancel joy," Sammy told him once as they sat watching the city lights from another hotel window. "It just makes it heavier," Dean smiled. "You always know how to say things," Sammy shrugged. "I learned from watching you not say them." The idea of an album began to circulate, first as suggestion, then as plan, not a collection of hits, a collection of Dean's own writing. The thought terrified him more than any performance ever had. A single song could be dismissed as a moment. An album would be a statement. It would mean standing in front of the world and saying, "This is what I have to say, not just what I can sing." Meetings were scheduled. Musicians consulted. Schedules rearranged. And each time the conversation turned toward commitment, Dean felt the same quiet fear he had felt on the piano bench in Frank's suite. The fear of silence, the fear of emptiness, the fear of finding out that 8 minutes had been all he had. One night after a long session that produced nothing he liked, Dean sat alone in the studio long after everyone else had gone. The lights were low. The instruments stood like sleeping animals. He placed his hands on the piano and played the opening chords of Before the Spotlight, not to rehearse it, to remind himself it existed, to remind himself he had once not known what would come out and something had. Sammy, who had been gathering his coat, paused at the door and watched without interrupting. When Dean finished, he did not turn. He simply said, "I'm scared it was a fluke." Sammy walked back into the room. "You know what scares me," he replied, "that you still think the part of you that told the truth was an accident." Dean was quiet. Sammy placed a hand on the back of the piano. It was you, and you're still here." Outside, the city continued the endless, glittering performance it always did. Inside, Dean Martin sat in the quiet and faced the most difficult audience he had ever known, himself. And for the first time in his career, he did not walk away from the stage. The legacy of 8 minutes. The album did not come easily. If before the spotlight had arrived like a breath, the rest of the songs demanded excavation. Dean spent months circling ideas that refused to open, sitting at pianos long after musicians packed up, scribbling lines he tore out and threw away, humming melodies that dissolved the moment he tried to capture them. Fame had never frightened him the way this process did. On stage, he knew who he was expected to be. In front of the microphone, with nothing to perform and nothing to hide behind, he had to decide who he actually was. Some nights he left studios frustrated, convinced he had mistaken a moment of honesty for a new identity. Other nights he walked out quietly, carrying fragments of songs about his childhood, about the distance between applause and affection, about watching his children grow, and realizing how much of their lives he had missed while he was busy becoming everyone else's idea of Dean Martin. Sammy remained a steady presence through it all, sometimes sitting silently at the back of the room for hours, sometimes interrupting a session with a joke precisely when Dean's seriousness began to harden into self-doubt. Frank dropped in unexpectedly, listening without comment, occasionally offering a single sentence that shifted an entire arrangement, then leaving before gratitude could be properly expressed. Slowly, imperfectly, a body of work took shape. It was not designed. It emerged. When the album was finally finished, Dean did not rush to hear it. The tapes sat on a table in the control room for several minutes before he crossed the space and picked them up. He held the reel as if it were fragile, even though it was not the plastic he feared breaking. It was the idea. He had recorded other people's songs for decades. He had interpreted them, elevated them, worn them. These were different. These were pieces of himself placed outside his body. He sat with Sammy and Frank behind the glass as the first track rolled, listening not as a star, but as a man meeting himself through sound. There were moments he liked, moments that made him uncomfortable, moments that felt too revealing, moments that surprised him. When the last note faded, no one spoke immediately, not because they did not know what to say, but because speaking would have broken the spell of recognition. Frank finally nodded once. Sammy exhaled. Dean stared at the console. "That's me," he said quietly, and for the first time in his career, he meant it without irony. When the album was released, the response was not explosive. It was enduring. Critics wrote about maturity, about depth, about transformation. Some fans were confused, some were exhilarated, some listened in silence and did not know what to say. But the record sold steadily, not because it was fashionable, because it was lived with. It became the kind of album people returned to rather than played through. And when it was nominated for awards, Dean watched the announcements from home, not with the hunger of ambition, but with the strange calm of someone who had already received what mattered. Recognition was pleasant. Discovery was irreversible. On stage, his performances evolved. He still sang the songs people loved. He still joked. He still charmed. But now there were moments in every show when the lights softened, the band quieted, and he sat at a piano and offered something unguarded. Each time he sang before the spotlight, he remembered the night it had arrived. He remembered the watch on Frank's wrist, the hush in the room, the way Sammy had stood without realizing it. He remembered the feeling of not knowing what would come next and allowing it anyway. And each time the audience responded not with excitement, but with recognition. They did not cheer through it. They listened. They carried their own stories into its spaces. They left with something heavier than entertainment and lighter than confession. They left with permission. Years passed. The Rat Pack era shifted, transformed, loosened into legend. Careers diverged. Paths widened. Loss entered the circle in ways youth never anticipates. Through it all, that song remained. It followed Dean through television sets and benefit concerts, through solo performances and shared stages, through rooms filled with nostalgia and rooms filled with strangers too young to remember when he had been anything but a name. In interviews, when asked about it, he no longer told the story as a novelty. He told it as a turning point. He spoke about the fear of that piano bench, about the surprise of finding something true, about the way a friend's challenge had uncovered a door he did not know existed. And when young artists asked him what mattered, he did not speak about contracts or charts or longevity. He spoke about honesty, about daring to be seen before you are understood. Sammy, in those later years, often watched Dean from the wings. He saw the way the audience's relationship with him had changed. He saw how people leaned in now rather than back, how applause followed silence instead of drowning it. One night after a benefit show in Los Angeles, Sammy joined Dean backstage as he removed his jacket, slower now, more carefully than before. "You know," Sammy said thoughtfully, "you didn't just write a song that night. You gave people language for something they didn't know how to say." Dean smiled faintly. "I was just trying to figure myself out," Sammy nodded. "That's usually how it starts." Frank and Dean spoke less frequently as the years layered themselves over their lives, but when they did, the conversations were unhurried and stripped of pretense. Once after a charity concert long after the height of their fame, they sat together in a quiet dressing room, the sounds of dismantled stages echoing faintly through the corridors. Frank lit a cigarette and studied Dean's reflection in the mirror. "You ever think about that night?" he asked. Dean nodded. "More than I probably should," Frank smiled. "Best $1,000 I ever lost," Dean chuckled softly. "Best one I ever won." Frank grew serious. "You know, if I hadn't pushed you, you might have gone your whole life thinking you were only one thing." Dean met his gaze. "You didn't push me, you trusted me." Frank shook his head. "Same difference." Time, indifferent to legend, continued its work. Voices aged, bodies slowed, friends were lost. When Dean's health began to fail, he retreated from the stage, not bitterly but quietly, as though stepping back into himself rather than away from the world. Music still filled his home, sometimes recordings, sometimes memories, sometimes his own hands on the piano, softer now, slower, but still searching. Sammy visited when he could, sitting nearby, letting the silence be companionable rather than empty. On one such afternoon, Dean played a few halting chords from before the spotlight and stopped. "Funny," he said. "I wrote that wanting to go back, and it ended up taking me forward." Sammy smiled. "That's what truth does." After Dean passed, the song did not recede. It surfaced in tributes, in documentaries, and retrospectives that tried to explain what had happened to him in the middle of a career built on ease. When Frank's time came years later, the song appeared again, not as a performance, but as a remembrance played quietly among others that marked their shared history. People spoke about that bet, about the suite, about the 10 minutes, but those who understood spoke about something else, about friendship, about permission, about the courage to challenge someone you love to become who they are. The story traveled, through biographies, through classrooms, through conversations between musicians who had never met any of them. It was told as a lesson in creativity, but its deeper current was always the same. That sometimes the greatest gift one person can give another is not praise, but belief. Not applause, but a challenge. Not comfort, but an invitation to step beyond the version of yourself you have learned to survive inside. Long after the lights that once crowned the sands dimmed, long after the Rat Pack became history instead of headline, the echo of 8 minutes in a hotel suite remained. A reminder that art is not born from cleverness, but from courage. That vulnerability is not weakness, but access. That identity is not something we perform, but something we allow. Dean Martin did not set out to change his life that night. He sat at a piano to settle a bet. What he did instead was discover a voice he had never trusted himself to use. And by doing so, he gave others permission to search for their own. The world remembers the legends, but what endures are the moments when those legends stopped performing and started telling the truth.